Imagine waking up, right, to a broadcast from the executive branch of your government announcing that an adversary's military has been utterly obliterated.
Right.
The leadership is gone, the war is functionally over, and the administration is, weeks ahead of schedule for securing an unconditional surrender. You probably breathe a huge sigh of relief.
Yeah, of course you would.
But then, barely a few hours later, that exact same executive office issues this frantic, desperate alert, a 48-hour ultimatum warning that if this supposedly obliterated enemy doesn't immediately reopen a critical global shipping lane, your country is going to suffer catastrophic economic consequences.
It makes no sense.
Exactly. You sit there looking at these two statements and you have to ask yourself, well, how does a destroyed enemy hold the entire global economy hostage?
And that paradox, that is the defining signature of the crisis we are analyzing today. Because when the political rhetoric of a conflict completely detaches from the physical reality on the ground, the traditional frameworks we use to understand warfare they begin to fracture.
Yeah, they break down completely.
Right. We are watching a real-time collapse of legacy geopolitical assumptions.
So welcome to this deep dive. Consider this session a rigorous, graduate-level seminar designed to cut through that exact paradox.
Exactly.
We're moving past the surface-level political sound bites, the daily outrage cycles, and the curated press briefings. Instead, we're going to critically synthesize a highly complex, rapidly evolving systemic crisis involving the United States, Israel, and Iran.
And to do that, we'll be looking at the structural mechanics of asymmetric warfare, the physics of modern deterrence, and the acute vulnerabilities of global supply chains.
Right. And to conduct this structural analysis, we are drawing from an extensive and highly varied repository of primary materials today.
Yeah, we're synthesizing declassified military briefings, intelligence community assessments, and strategic analyses from international relations scholars. Most notably, the structural realist frameworks of John Mearsheimer.
Which are crucial here.
Very crucial. And we are also incorporating incredibly diverse regional media transcripts, right? Pulling raw data from Western outlets like Reuters and the BBC, official Israeli defense reports, Arab media networks like Al Jazeera, and even Iranian state broadcasts.
And before we get into the actual mechanics of this conflict, we need to establish a very clear baseline for you, the listener.
Right, this is important.
Because the sources we are parsing today contain highly polarized, fundamentally conflicting, and intensely politically charged narratives. We are dealing with active psychological operations and state-sanctioned messaging from every single actor involved here.
I mean, it's an active information war.
Exactly. So this deep dive will impartially deconstruct these claims strictly as data points within that ongoing information war. We are not endorsing any state actor, any ideology, or any military action.
Right. Our objective is purely analytical. We just want to read the raw data and help you understand the underlying machinery of this multi-front escalation.
So to understand that machinery, I think we have to start at the conceptual foundation, which is the military doctrines driving the kinetic action, right?
Yes. We are observing a violent intersection of two entirely incompatible philosophies of warfare here.
Yeah.
The stated military objectives of the United States and Israel, as documented in our sources, they rely on frameworks like U.S. Central Command's Operation Epic Fury and Israel's Dahiyya Doctrine.
I really want to stop on the Dahiyya Doctrine for a second because understanding its history is so critical to understanding why it is failing so spectacularly here.
Absolutely.
So the doctrine takes its name from the Dahiyya neighborhood in Beirut during the 2006 Lebanon War. The core premise, basically, is the application of overwhelming, disproportionate force against civilian and government infrastructure to achieve deterrence.
Right. It's essentially a strategy of maximum infrastructural trauma combined with the systematic elimination of leadership, what military strategists, what they call decapitation.
Yeah. The logic is that if you cause enough undeniable pain and eliminate the command structure, the adversary will just be paralyzed into submission.
The intention is to break the psychological will of the adversary by ensuring the cost of continued resistance is absolute destruction. You eliminate the leadership layer and you completely level the operational environment.
But the data reveals a profound structural misapplication of this doctrine, doesn't it?
It really does. I mean, they are taking a strategy explicitly developed to contain localized, non-state militias operating in very confined geographic areas like Hezbollah in southern Lebanon or Hamas in Gaza, and they're attempting to apply it to a massive, highly institutionalized sovereign nation-state.
It feels like trying to diagnose a software issue using a wrench.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
And Iran's counter strategy, which the sources identify as Operation True Promise 4, it demonstrates a fundamental shift in how they are responding to that threat.
Right, because for decades, Iran operated on a posture of what they called strategic patience.
Basically absorbing localized strikes.
Exactly. Absorbing strikes, relying on proxy skirmishes, and really avoiding direct state-on-state confrontation. But True Promise 4 throws that completely out the window.
They've shifted to active escalation dominance.
Right. Yes, implementing what looks like regionalized guerrilla warfare, but executed at the level of a nation-state.
Yeah.
They are refusing to absorb the kinetic strikes internally anymore.
So instead, Iran's explicit strategy is to externalize the cost of the conflict across the entire region.
Right, turning what was designed as a localized decapitation strike into a sprawling, multi-front war of attrition.
And the threshold they have crossed to demonstrate this operational shift, I mean, it involves the most sensitive strategic assets on the board. We're talking about nuclear-adjacent facilities.
Which is huge. The sources detail U.S. and Israeli strikes targeting Iran's highly fortified enrichment facilities at Natanz and Fordow.
And historically, striking the crown jewels of a nation's nuclear infrastructure is the ultimate red line.
Oh, without a doubt. The conventional assumption in Western military planning has always been that hitting those sites would force a regime to capitulate, or at least lash out blindly and uncoordinatedly.
But the Iranian response was neither capitulation nor uncoordinated.
Not at all. The data indicates they answered with heavy ballistic missile strikes directly on the Israeli city of Dimona.
Which houses Israel's primary, heavily fortified nuclear research center.
Exactly. Dimona, as well as the neighboring city of Arad. And the casualty reports we have from regional media and Israeli sources, they indicate over 100 casualties in those strikes.
They managed to bypass multiple layers of advanced air defense to strike the immediate geographic vicinity of a nuclear facility.
Yes. And this brings up a massive theoretical question about how states behave when they're pushed to the absolute brink.
Which is where Mearsheimer's work really comes into play, right?
Exactly. When you look at the international relations theory surrounding this, particularly the work of John Mearsheimer that's highlighted in our sources, he argues forcefully that decapitation strategies are empirically ineffective against large, well-established state apparatuses.
Yeah, Mearsheimer points to historical precedents, like the strategic bombing campaigns of World War II.
Right, noting that you simply cannot bomb a massive bureaucracy into submission. A state with over 90 million people and a highly institutionalized 40-year-old military framework does not just disintegrate because its top executives are eliminated.
The bureaucracy simply activates the next layer of the hierarchy.
Exactly. And Mearsheimer ties this to the concept of existential threat perception. When a rational actor, meaning a state regime focused on its own survival, is backed completely into a corner and threatened with total eradication, the traditional calculus of deterrence just evaporates.
Because if the aggressor's stated goal is your absolute destruction, there is no longer any incentive for restraint. You have nothing left to lose.
Right. The rational move is to escalate to the maximum degree, utilizing every single weapon in your arsenal to ensure that the cost of your destruction is unacceptably high for the aggressor.
Furthermore, the belief that localized infrastructural pain will translate into systemic collapse ignores the architectural reality of the defending state.
I mean, Iran has spent the last 4 decades operating under heavy international sanctions and the constant threat of preemptive strikes.
Right.
They have specifically designed their infrastructure and their military command to survive this exact scenario.
You know, I was trying to visualize this structural mismatch earlier. A lot of political rhetoric describes eliminating leadership, like cutting the head off a snake.
Sure, you hear that a lot.
But applying the Dahiya doctrine to Iran isn't like cutting the head off a snake.
Yeah.
I think it is more like trying to destroy a modern mesh Wi-Fi network by unplugging a single router in the living room.
Oh, that's a really good analogy.
Right. In a traditional network, if you take out the main hub, everything goes dark. But Iran built a mesh network. Their command structures are decentralized, their strategic assets are buried deep underground, and their power grids are completely segmented.
So if you strike one node, the signal instantly reroutes through 3 other redundant nodes.
Exactly. The network doesn't go down, it just adapts and keeps transmitting.
That is a highly accurate mechanical analogy. The loss of individual leaders does not halt the operational capacity of the military machine because the authority to launch counterstrikes has already been delegated to regional autonomous nodes.
Right.
So when a decapitation strategy fails to produce a rapid psychological surrender, the conflict instantly devolves into a war of attrition.
And that forces us to examine the physical, technological capabilities on the battlefield, because the defending state is now projecting power far beyond its own borders.
Which brings us to the disruption of hegemonic air superiority.
We really need to talk about the sheer geography of this power projection. For years, the prevailing intelligence assumption was that Iran's ballistic missile range was effectively capped at around 2,000 kilometers.
Right. And this was a somewhat self-imposed limit, but it acted as a crucial buffer zone.
Yeah, it allowed Western and Allied forces to position their logistical hubs, command centers, and heavy bombers just outside that 2,000-kilometer radius, basically assuming they were operating in a safe sanctuary.
But the sources confirm that this geographic ceiling has been comprehensively shattered.
Completely.
I mean, Iran executed ballistic missile strikes on the joint U.S.-UK military base at Diego Garcia, which is located deep in the Indian Ocean. We're looking at a strike radius of approximately 3,800 to 4,000 kilometers.
That is massive. And the physics of a ballistic trajectory at that range require immense propulsion, sophisticated guidance systems to survive atmospheric reentry, and, significant payload capacity.
And the implication of that range expansion is just staggering. Even if the strike did not level the entire base at Diego Garcia, the physical demonstration of that capability fundamentally rewrites the strategic map.
Right, because suddenly assets that were considered untouchable logistical sanctuaries are sitting right on the front lines. You can no longer stage a massive air campaign from a safe distance if your runways and your fuel depots are within the adversary strike radius.
Exactly. And this geographic expansion is paired with a technological penetration of Israel's multi-layered air defense matrix.
Which is arguably the most densely protected, technologically advanced airspace on the entire planet.
Yeah. The architecture is designed to intercept threats at literally every altitude and range. You have the Iron Dome system handling short-range, unguided rockets and artillery.
Right.
You have David's Sling, designed for medium-range cruise missiles and slower ballistic threats. And critically, you have the Arrow 2 and Arrow 3 systems, which are designed for exo-atmospheric ballistic missile interception.
Okay, I want to pause and explain what exo-atmospheric interception actually means, because honestly, it sounds like science fiction.
It really does.
When a heavy ballistic missile is fired from a distance of 1,500 or 2,000 kilometers, it doesn't just fly through the air. It leaves the Earth's atmosphere entirely.
Right. It travels through the vacuum of space.
Exactly. It travels through the vacuum of space before re-entering the atmosphere at hypersonic speeds, often exceeding Mach 10 or 15, to strike its target. So the Arrow 3 system is designed to launch an interceptor missile into space, track the incoming warhead, and physically collide with it in the vacuum of space before it ever re-enters the atmosphere.
It is literally hitting a bullet with a bullet while both are traveling at thousands of miles per hour in the dark.
Yeah. Now, the official claims from the IDF, which are cited extensively in the sources, boast an extraordinary 92% successful interception rate against incoming Iranian projectiles across all these systems.
However, the raw data we are looking at from Dimona and Arad, the localized reporting, the casualty figures, the visual evidence of impacts, it all fundamentally challenges the narrative of an impenetrable shield.
Right, because a 92% interception rate sounds incredible on paper. But if an adversary fires 200 heavy ballistic missiles and 8% get through, well, that is 16 city-leveling warheads impacting your most sensitive nuclear and civilian infrastructure.
Exactly. The defensive matrix can be mathematically saturated.
Yeah.
If you fire enough decoys, drones, and varied missile types simultaneously, the defense system simply runs out of interceptor missiles, or its radar systems become completely overwhelmed by the sheer volume of targets.
But saturation is just one method of defeating the matrix. The sources point to a far more alarming technological circumvention, don't they?
Yes. The most significant claim in this entire dataset is the reported downing of advanced Western fighter jets. Specifically, an F-35 stealth fighter and an F-16 over central Iran, utilizing indigenous, upgraded Iranian anti-aircraft systems.
Okay, we really need to break down the mechanics of this because the F-35 is not just an airplane. It is a trillion-dollar investment by the U.S. military-industrial complex.
Right. It's the crown jewel of Western air power.
Exactly. The entire operational premise of the F-35 is its stealth capability. It relies on advanced faceted geometry and highly classified radar-absorbent materials, or RAM, to reduce its radar cross-section to, like, the size of a golf ball.
It is designed to be a ghost.
Yeah. penetrating contested airspace unseen, destroying air defenses, and paving the way for non-stealth bombers to operate freely.
So if the F-35 cannot survive contested airspace, the entire foundation of Western power projection collapses.
Right.
The source material suggests a critical vulnerability in the F-35's design when facing asymmetric detection methods. Iran's indigenous defense systems reportedly did not rely on traditional radio frequency radar, which the F-35 is heavily optimized to defeat or jam.
Instead, they utilized advanced infrared search and track systems, right? IRST.
Yes, IRST, which focus purely on thermal signatures.
Which makes perfect mechanical sense when you think about it.
Right.
The F-35 is powered by the F-135 engine, which generates nearly 40,000 pounds of thrust.
It's a massive engine.
Right. You can paint a jet with all the radar-absorbent material in the world, and you can shape it perfectly to deflect radio waves. But you cannot hide the laws of thermodynamics.
No, you can't.
That engine produces a massive blazing thermal plume. So if an adversary shifts their detection paradigm from bouncing radio waves to passively staring at the sky looking for massive heat anomalies, the stealth geometry becomes totally irrelevant.
Exactly. And this highlights the distinct advantage of domestic indigenous defense manufacturing. Because Iran has been locked out of global arms markets by decades of sanctions, they have not simply relied on importing foreign defense systems like the Russian S-300 or S-400.
While they possess legacy versions of those systems, their strategic focus has been on homegrown development.
Right. And when a nation relies on imported, off-the-shelf technology, the adversary's intelligence agencies have usually already acquired the blueprints, mapped its frequencies, and programmed their jets to jam its specific radar algorithms.
But if you build the detection algorithms yourself, in secret, the enemy doesn't have the countermeasures.
Exactly. Indigenous systems allow for rapid, unpredicted tactical adaptations. They can tweak the thermal tracking sensitivity, network their optical sensors in novel ways, and deploy detection frequencies that legacy Western warning receivers are just not programmed to recognize as a threat until the missile is already off the rail.
So are we witnessing a modern dreadnought moment in military history here?
That's the question, isn't it?
I mean, in 1906, the British Royal Navy launched the HMS Dreadnought, a battleship so advanced in its armor and its unified main battery that it instantly rendered every other battleship on Earth obsolete. It leveled the playing field overnight.
And the data suggests we may be seeing a technological inversion of that moment, right?
Yeah.
Where massive trillion-dollar legacy investments in stealth platforms are suddenly rendered highly vulnerable by relatively low-cost, asymmetric, indigenous optical and thermal tracking technologies.
And if you cannot establish uncontested air dominance, you cannot execute the Dahia Doctrine.
No, you can't.
You cannot bomb the soil beneath the grass if your planes are being shot down by thermal tracking missiles.
Yeah.
The military strategy fundamentally breaks down.
Which forces the conflict into an entirely new arena. When a state realizes it cannot achieve a swift, decisive kinetic victory, and the physical reality on the battlefield contradicts its geopolitical narrative, we see the onset of profound strategic incoherence.
Yeah.
The disconnect between the military facts and the executive messaging becomes a structural crisis of its own.
And this brings us back to the cognitive dissonance we discussed at the very beginning of the deep dive.
Yes, the paradox.
The sources highlight public statements from the U.S. executive branch claiming Iran's military has been obliterated, that the U.S. is weeks ahead of schedule, and that a surrender is imminent.
Right.
But concurrently, the exact same administration issues a desperate 48-hour ultimatum, expiring at precisely 7:44 p.m. on Monday, threatening to systematically dismantle Iran's civilian power grid if the Strait of Hormuz is not reopened to international shipping.
The structural analysis here is just glaring. Those two realities cannot coexist. You do not issue a desperate, time-bound ultimatum to an enemy that has already been destroyed.
No, you don't.
If the Iranian leadership is decapitated and the military apparatus is obliterated, who exactly is the ultimatum directed toward? Who maintains the organizational capacity to blockade one of the world's most critical maritime choke points?
This dissonance exposes a massive institutional fracture within the U.S. intelligence and policymaking apparatus. We rely on the concept of strategic ambiguity in statecraft, right? Intentionally keeping your adversary guessing about your red lines and capabilities.
Right.
But what we are observing in the source data is not strategic ambiguity. It is strategic incoherence. The administration is demanding a reality that physically does not exist.
And the fracture goes even deeper when we examine the stated casus belli, the initial justification for the preemptive strikes. Operations like Midnight Hammer were allegedly launched under the premise of neutralizing an imminent nuclear weapons threat from Iran.
But the intelligence data explicitly contradicts this narrative.
Completely. The sources reveal that a consensus of 18 different U.S. intelligence agencies, meaning the entirety of the intelligence community's analytical apparatus, assessed that Iran possessed no imminent nuclear weapons capability.
The intelligence community unanimously said the threat did not exist, yet the military operations were launched anyway based on executive and allied policy desires.
Yes, and the sources detail the fallout from this, including high-profile resignations within the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, or ODNI.
Officials like Joe Kent are cited as resigning in protest.
Right, publicly stating that rigorous empirical intelligence assessments were being entirely overridden by political narratives heavily influenced by external state actors, specifically Israel.
We are looking at a classic manifestation of information asymmetry within domestic politics. Psychological operations and legacy media narratives are utilized to manufacture consent for conflict.
A simplified, highly emotive narrative, like an imminent nuclear threat, is propagated through media channels, effectively bypassing the nuanced, data-driven assessments of the state's own intelligence agencies.
But this isn't just a public relations problem. It is a structural crisis in civil-military relations. I mean, if the executive branch launches a war to eradicate a nuclear program that its own intelligence agencies say doesn't exist, how do you define victory?
You can't. You cannot verify the destruction of a weapon that was never built.
Exactly. Without a verifiable metric for victory, formulating a viable exit strategy becomes virtually impossible.
The state becomes trapped in an escalation spiral. It cannot admit the initial premise was flawed, so it must continually redefine the objectives, leaning into increasingly severe economic and infrastructural threats to force a capitulation that the adversary is structurally incapable of providing.
Which perfectly explains the shift from targeted military strikes to the desperation of the 48-hour ultimatum. The U.S. administration realized it couldn't win the air war to force capitulation, so they had to pivot to threatening the civilian power grid.
Right.
But by issuing that ultimatum over the Strait of Hormuz, they exposed their absolute greatest vulnerability, which is the global supply chain.
The conflict pivots from a localized exchange of munitions to the full weaponization of global macroeconomics.
Yeah.
The Strait of Hormuz is the central nervous system of the global energy market. The sources are definitive on the immediate impact of its total closure. Oil prices surging to $108 a barrel, precipitating what analysts are calling the most severe energy crisis since the 1970s.
Let's break down the actual mechanics of the strait, because it is not just a line drawn on a map.
No, it's a physical choke point.
Right. At its narrowest point, the strait is only about 21 miles wide, and the actual shipping lanes that are deep enough for massive supertankers are only 2 miles wide in either direction.
It's incredibly tight.
So if a defending nation with an expansive coastline along that narrow channel deploys anti-ship cruise missiles, swarm drones, and naval mines, commercial shipping insurance rates instantly skyrocket to impossible premiums.
Right.
The physical movement of energy simply stops.
And
Think about everything in the room you are sitting in right now. The materials required to build your house, the laptop on your desk, the food in your refrigerator. Every single item was moved multiple times by a diesel-powered engine before it reached you.
Exactly.
When the cost of diesel spikes exponentially, the cost of every physical good on a grocery store shelf inflates with it. The closure of the strait acts as a regressive tax on the entire global economy.
But the sources highlight an even more severe, often overlooked structural consequence of the strait's closure, which is an impending agricultural catastrophe.
Yeah, this part is terrifying.
Because it is not just crude oil flowing through that choke point, 35% of the global feedstock for fertilizer, specifically urea, passes through the Strait of Hormuz.
We need to unpack the chemistry of this to really understand the stakes here. Urea is a highly concentrated nitrogen fertilizer. It is produced by combining ammonia and carbon dioxide, a process that requires massive amounts of natural gas, much of which is sourced from the Persian Gulf. Without the application of synthetic nitrogen fertilizers, derived from urea, the global agricultural system simply cannot sustain the current human population. Crop yields would plummet by nearly 50%.
Therefore, a prolonged closure of the strait is not just an energy crisis. It is a direct, medium-term threat to global food security.
A disruption of that magnitude guarantees massive food inflation and precipitates potential famine conditions in vulnerable, import-dependent regions worldwide.
The defending state has successfully weaponized the basic requirements of global survival.
And this highlights the sheer asymmetry of vulnerability in this conflict. The U.S. and Israeli strategy relies on conducting precision strikes against specific military and nuclear sites within Iran.
Right.
But Iran's explicitly stated counter-strategy is to externalize the pain by attacking the central, highly fragile nodes of the global economy and regional infrastructure.
The sources detail explicit counter-threats emanating from the Iranian military command. They have established a clear deterrent equation here. If the United States executes its 48-hour ultimatum and strikes Iranian civilian energy or power grids, Iran will systematically target the desalination plants of critical U.S. allies in the Gulf, specifically pointing to the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia.
The mechanics of this threat are genuinely terrifying to think about.
Oh, they are.
Destroying a desalination plant is not like cratering a military runway where you can patch the concrete in a few days. Let's look at how these plants actually work. Major capital cities in the Gulf, Riyadh, Dubai, Abu Dhabi, these are massive metropolises built in arid desert environments.
They rely almost entirely on highly centralized, incredibly complex coastal facilities that utilize reverse osmosis to force seawater through microscopic membranes to produce fresh, drinkable water.
Right. And these desalination plants require immense amounts of continuous electrical power, massive intake pipes drawing directly from the vulnerable coastline, and highly specialized fragile filtration infrastructure.
They are massive soft targets. If a barrage of ballistic missiles or swarm drones destroys these facilities, the consequences are existential.
You cannot simply truck in enough bottled water to sustain populations of 8 to 10 million people in a desert where temperatures reach 115 degrees.
You'd have days at best.
Exactly. Within days of losing their desalination capacity, these major global financial hubs would become entirely uninhabitable. You would witness an immediate, unprecedented refugee crisis and the functional collapse of those nation-states.
Right. Iran is essentially saying, you can hit our power grid, and we will endure the blackouts and rebuild. But if we hit your water supply, your nations cease to exist.
It is the ultimate form of asymmetric deterrence. They are holding the physical survival of regional U.S. allies and the stability of the global economy hostage to prevent further kinetic escalation against their own domestic infrastructure.
And if we extrapolate the long-term monetary consequences of this blockade, the source data points to a systemic restructuring of global finance.
Yeah, the sources indicate that as the conflict drags on, Iran intends to demand that any energy trade it does permit be conducted in petro-yuan rather than U.S. dollars.
It is a massive escalation. It transforms a military conflict into an active acceleration of de-dollarization.
Because the foundational architecture of Western financial hegemony relies heavily on the petrodollar system, right?
Yes, the global requirement that oil be purchased in U.S. dollars.
Right. This forces nations worldwide to hold massive reserves of U.S. currency, structurally subsidizing the U.S. economy and allowing the United States to utilize the SWIFT financial system as a weapon of statecraft.
But if the primary commodity driving the global economy begins trading heavily in alternative currencies like the yuan, the ability of the United States to leverage its currency for global dominance is severely curtailed.
And this economic decoupling leads directly to the massive strain this conflict is placing on historical alliances. We are witnessing the physical and political contraction of the unipolar theater.
The structural integrity of NATO and allied defense architectures is completely fracturing under the pressure of these asymmetric threats.
The data highlights a severe political crisis unfolding in the United Kingdom right now as a direct result of Allied dependency.
Yes, the UK government, under the Prime Minister, permitted the United States to utilize strategic bases, specifically RAF Fairford in England and the Diego Garcia facility in the British Indian Ocean Territory, for offensive operations against Iran.
And crucially, the executive permitted this without seeking parliamentary approval.
Which sparked massive domestic political backlash.
Of course it did. Diego Garcia isn't just a random island. It is sovereign British territory leased to the U.S. military. By bypassing the democratic process to allow a U.S. preemptive strike from its territory, the U.K. effectively entered a war without the consent of its own government.
Right, and because Iran demonstrated it has the ballistic missile range to hit Diego Garcia and explicitly warned that UK assets are now legitimate targets, the British public suddenly finds itself on the front lines of a war it had no say in starting.
This political crisis exposes the inherent danger of extended deterrence and allied dependency. But the geopolitical fracturing goes beyond European politics. We must examine the material limitations of the U.S. industrial base itself.
The source data reveals a startling, almost paradoxical vulnerability. The United States lacks the deep industrial capacity required to sustain a prolonged, high-intensity war of attrition.
The specific data point in the sources regarding the defense supply chain is just mind-blowing to me. The sources note that the United States relies on China for 98 to 99% of its supply of gallium.
Yes.
To understand why this matters, you have to understand modern military technology. Gallium isn't just some random metal. It is refined into gallium nitride, or GaN, which is the foundational semiconductor material required to build Advanced Active Electronically Scanned Array, or AESA, radars.
Because silicon is simply no longer sufficient to handle the immense power and thermal loads required by modern military transmitters. Whether it is the advanced radar in the nose of an F-35, the tracking systems of a Patriot missile battery, or the communication arrays on an Aegis destroyer, they all require gallium nitride to function.
So we have a profound strategic paradox here. The United States is engaging in a massive, high-intensity conflict that rapidly depletes its stockpile of advanced munitions and stealth platforms. Yet, it relies almost entirely on its primary global peer competitor, China, for the raw, rare earth elements necessary to manufacture replacements.
It's an incredible vulnerability.
If China simply halts the export of gallium, the U.S. defense industrial base literally cannot build the eyes of its missile defense systems or the core components of its stealth fighters. In a prolonged conflict, the primary competitor holds functional veto power over the U.S. military's ability to wage war.
And you have to combine that structural industrial vulnerability with the activation of regional proxy networks across the Middle East. The sources note that the Iraqi resistance, operating in tandem with the broader Axis, has effectively pressured and evicted NATO forces from Iraq, forcing a total recalibration of the Western military posture in the Levant.
Simultaneously, the Houthi movement in Yemen has utilized asymmetric drone and missile tactics to effectively choke the Bab el-Mandeb Strait and the Red Sea, compounding the macroeconomic disaster of the Strait of Hormuz closure. When you synthesize all these data points, the failure of the air defense matrix, the vulnerability of the supply chains, the vulnerability of the desalination plants, what we are observing is the terminal exposure of the limitations of extended deterrence.
Yes. For decades, the foundational security architecture of the Gulf relied on the absolute guarantee of the United States.
Right. Gulf nations hosted massive U.S. military bases under the assumption that the mere presence of American forces would provide an impenetrable shield against any regional threat.
But the empirical reality of this conflict has inverted that assumption entirely. Gulf nations are realizing that hosting U.S. bases does not make them safer. It paints a massive, unavoidable target on their backs.
It makes their fragile critical infrastructure, their water supply, and their capital cities legitimate collateral targets in a systemic war they did not initiate and cannot control.
This realization is forcing a profound, permanent recalibration of regional security dependencies. The U.S. security umbrella is now perceived not as a shield, but as a lightning rod.
That structural shift is staggering. It forces us to ask the ultimate question of this deep dive. Does this conflict signify the terminal overextension of the American empire?
It's the multi-trillion-dollar question.
When you compare the theoretical military requirement to resolve this crisis, which the strategic analysts in our sources suggest would require deploying hundreds of thousands of ground troops just to secure the Iranian coastline and physically reopen the Strait of Hormuz, against the absolute political, economic, and industrial impossibility of actually executing such a deployment, are we watching the limits of unipolar empire being reached in real time?
It is a question that will likely dominate international relations scholarship for decades. The empirical inability to impose military will, achieve regime decapitation, or secure vital maritime choke points without suffering unacceptable systemic economic damage strongly suggests that the unipolar moment, the era where a single superpower could dictate global outcomes with impunity, has irrevocably passed.
Let's synthesize the findings of this seminar for you. What began as a localized application of a preemptive strike doctrine has mutated into a massive, systemic test of military technology, economic resilience, and hegemonic stability.
We have seen that decapitation strategies, the Dahiya doctrine, have fundamentally failed to yield capitulation when applied to a highly structured, decentralized state apparatus.
Right. Instead, asymmetric infrastructure targeting by the defending nation has successfully paralyzed critical global supply chains, bringing the global economy and the agricultural sector to the brink.
The technological revelations derived from the data, the empirical defeat of fifth-generation stealth platforms via thermal tracking, and the exponential expansion of ballistic missile ranges penetrating advanced defense matrices have completely rewritten the strategic calculus.
Furthermore, the profound cognitive dissonance between the policy objectives of the executive branch and the physical realities acknowledged by the intelligence community has generated a dangerous strategic incoherence, leaving basically no viable off-ramp for de-escalation.
The tools we use to understand international relations are fracturing because the rules of the game have fundamentally changed. The blueprint is simply obsolete.
Which leaves us with a critical reevaluation of the global order.
Ex-
So we want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over long after this deep dive ends. The entire foundational architecture of post-World War II global security and the stability of global financial markets relies heavily on the absolute deterrence and the perceived technological invulnerability of a singular superpower.
Right.
But what happens to international law, to the cohesion of global alliances, and to the sanctity of the U.S. dollar the morning after it is empirically proven that a regional middle power can effectively absorb the superpower's maximum conventional kinetic blow, shatter its technological mythos in the skies, and still dictate the terms of global trade. When the dust settles on this conflict, the world may wake up to find that the unipolar shield was an illusion all along.